Good afternoon and welcome to the third and final day of the Media Freedom Rapid Response Online Summit, this year taking place under the title Boosting Press Freedom. For our final day, we will focus on pluralist media for a democratic society. At 2 p.m., Oliver Monique-Curl, the head of Europe Advocacy and Programs at the International Press Institute, will chair a panel on competing models of media capture in Europe with contributions from Bulgaria, Czech Republic and Hungary. At 3:30, journalist and chair of the ECPMF Supervisory Board, Lucy Sikorova, will moderate a panel on the tremendous challenges faced by local media outlets, which are critical to informing citizens and enabling democratic participation. At 4:30, we shift focus to the war in Ukraine with an interview with independent journalist Olga Tokariuk. The summit will close with a workshop at 5 p.m. under the title Reported, where you can discover the new Alert Explorer on mapping media freedom, the hub of the MFRR systematic monitoring of media freedom in the region. As in previous days, all sessions are streamed and accessible to all, with the exception of the workshop, which takes place on Zoom and requires registration. You can still sign up via the program page on mfrr.eu. We will start this final summit day with a keynote address by Veronika Munk, editor-in-chief of Hungarian independent news website Telex. She will talk about leading a successful independent media outlet in what is the most captured media environment in Europe, and how this is impacting the election campaign and prospects for free and fair elections.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today on day 3 of the MFRR Summit. The theme of today is the importance of media pluralism for a democratic society. And no other EU country has seen over the last year such a kind of onslaught of pluralism in the country than in Hungary under the Fidesz government of Prime Minister Viktor Orban. And in recent years, media pluralism has been really eroded as private media was sold off to business allies of the ruling party. Oligarchs acquired much of the media landscape. Public media has really been brought under control of the ruling party as well. And we've seen increasing efforts to kind of push and silence what remains of independent media there as well. Few journalists have a better first-hand experience in this than Veronika Munk, the founding editor-in-chief and the current head of content development at Telex, Hungary, one of the major independent media in the country, which was formed when its predecessor Index, all its staff quit after the editor-in-chief was fired for voicing concerns about editorial independence. So Veronika, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So obviously I want to definitely talk about media capture. But of course, we're in the gearing up to an election in Hungary right now, and everything in Ukraine has become a major flashpoint. So I think it would be really interesting to start there, because media is obviously very involved as well. So it's become a really kind of unexpected flashpoint in the campaign, I imagine, and really added a kind of a new dimension. The first question would just be to hear what kind of impact the war in Ukraine has had on the media in Hungary, how it's being covered so far, particularly by the public broadcaster.
It was, of course, like everywhere in the world, this war affected somehow every aspect of lives of people, and it happened in the Hungarian media sphere and in Telex's life as well. Especially that this war basically happened the same time when the campaign, the political campaign started. This election in Hungary, the upcoming elections, is on the 3rd of April, which is basically a contest between the two big political forces in Hungary, the current government and the united opposition. And I would say that in this bipolar system, we are seeing the usual campaigning methods in Hungary that we used to see, that the political forces campaigning in a rather negative tone towards oppositional, towards their opposing political forces. So they are not primarily vocal about their own strengths, but they are pushing messages about their opponents in the media. And before the war happened, I expected a much more intense, and I can honestly say a much more violent campaign period in Hungary, but the war has made it much less intense, because mostly now, of course, the politicians have to talk about the war. They have to position themselves regarding the war in the public sphere. And your question was about the public service media in Hungary, which is a really easy answer for me, because the national public media in Hungary is not balanced at all. It is practically a mouthpiece for the governing parties, and in return they got loads of money. It operates of millions of euros of taxpayers' money, and they do it without any sanctions, without any consequences, mainly because the leadership of the media authority is also loyal to the government. And what we also see, that the Russian propaganda somehow appears in the Hungarian public service media and in the Hungarian language social media platforms, especially on Facebook as well.
Yeah, I think that's something that was quite unbelievable to see, you know, within an EU member state after the war broke out, the public broadcaster kind of echoing, you know, Kremlin talking points. And I think I'd seen reports that, you know, they weren't using the words war or invasion, but special military operation, this kind of thing.
That's correct. Yeah.
I mean, this is an element of capture of the public media, but, you know, how have we got to this stage now where this can happen in an EU member state?
How this happened? It was a really long period of time. I have been worked as a journalist in the last 20 years. Most of the time I worked for Index, my previous workplace, for 18 years. So I could really see how things changed a lot. And it changed slowly, but in the last basically 10 years, the situation hasn't changed that much. And you used to mention the state capture, and I think it's really precisely described the situation, because what happened that the media companies basically were bought up by businessmen, some call them oligarchs, who have strong connections to the government, and there are less and less critical independent media outlets like Telex, one of them, one of the largest. But yeah, so it's a situation about the ownership of the private media companies. The second aspect is what I mentioned, that the public service media doesn't really fulfill its public service function. Rather playing as a megaphone for the government. And there are other institutional aspects that strengthen this situation, that the Hungarian media sphere is heavily influenced by politics. I could mention the central, I don't know the English name of this organization, but in the Hungarian term it's KESMA. I'm sure you know the English name of this organization. It's a foundation which is supposed to be independent, but it's not. The head of this foundation and the board of the foundation is basically Orban loyalists, and this organization includes more than 500 media companies in the country. All of them were offered as a donation to this organization, and since then it's an almost 3-year-old organization. And since their operation started, it's a centralized, directly managed message spreader. I mean, politically speaking.
Yeah. KESMA is obviously a major kind of issue around pluralism in the Hungarian media system. And I was just wondering, you know, since the kind of public broadcast has been thrust into the spotlight through its coverage of Ukraine, I've seen a lot of reporting in, you know, regional and international media about how it's kind of struggled to change its tone. So I'd seen there'd been protests outside the headquarters of the public broadcaster in Budapest as well. So I wanted to ask, what kind of pushback there's been, and whether there's been a sort of a change in coverage in the face of public outrage, or whether they're still kind of towing the Russian line.
Well, we did not see any sanctions or any consequences, mainly because, as I mentioned, the media authority is also a pro-governmental organization, and I think it's interesting to know. It could be an interesting side note that the head of this media authority, who could sanction these kind of interventions when Russian propaganda is being seen on the public service media. But the head of this media authority, who is always elected for 9 years, suddenly resigned a few months ago. And there is a new head who is also loyal to the government, and he had been elected for also 9 years from now. And this gentleman will remain in place in the event of a possible oppositional election victory in April, and will oversee the public media again, which will, of course, I'm speaking hypothetically, but already will be on an oppositional government. So the answer to your questions, that basically nothing happens. People were protesting on the street, and there were some oppositional politicians who turned to the media authority, explaining that it is not okay that the public service media do not talk about the war, but about a special military operation, but nothing happened.
And then, another thing I wanted just to touch on while we're still kind of talking about public media was the recent revelations about the state news agency, the MTI, and some really kind of shocking pictures coming out of there, of behind the scenes of how it works, how it operates, how decisions are made, who is, controlling and influencing this body. So I know Telex had reported on this as well. So, I mean, it would be really interesting to just hear a kind of an overview of, what those findings were and what it shows about how controlled these bodies are.
Yeah, actually, it was I think less than 2 weeks ago when Telex's partner, the investigative journalism center Direct 36, published on Telex this lengthy 2-part investigative series on, and the journalist Zsuzsanna Wirt was writing about how the interest of the government communication have been overriding the rules of journalism at the Hungarian state news agency called MTI. And this 2 article is based on an extensive collection of MTI's internal email correspondence and other documents that prove that political interests shape the operation of the state news agency, which is supposed to be balanced, of course. And these emails and documentations from inside, internal communications from the news agency, show in detail that how independent news editing has become basically impossible for the publicly funded organization, and how the government's communication staff interfere with the content. I can say you some examples, some interesting examples from the articles written by Zsuzsanna Wirt, when the interests of governmental communication overcome journalistic rules in several ways. For instance, reporting about Viktor Orban's public appearances is carefully planned in advance. Detailed questions are prepared and for the news agency reporters, and instructions are given about what should be emphasized. And sometimes MTI reporters receive phone calls from ministry press officers who instructing them how to write an article. Sometimes the communiques of government bodies not possible to modified, not even shortened sometimes. And the same rule applies to the announcements of the corporate group of the pro-government oligarch and the personal friend of the Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and this businessman called Lőrinc Mészáros. That also was found in the documentation. And there were some other examples when the press officer of the Prime Minister wrote the title and the lead, the header of the article to the news agency, which they wasn't allowed to modify. They had to use it.
Yeah, I thought some of the revelations we saw there were unbelievable in terms of the kind of the scale of control and the kind of direct line from the press office of the Prime Minister to the the managers of the news agency. That was incredible to see, but also extremely worrying for independence of public service media as well.
And which was interesting for us, even for us as well, because if you are a journalist and living in Hungary, you hear things and you know things, but you cannot prove sometimes, because the pro-governmental communication is very greatly organized, and very rarely it could be proven how things works around this large machinery. So this collection of emails that was used as a source was really how great to see, or objectively see and objectively shown how things going in the state news agency as well.
Because we've seen in the past some kind of similar revelations about how operations are the public broadcaster as well, in terms of topics that are off limits to reporters, instructions from managers to ignore certain issues, focus on others. So in the context of the election, how independent has the coverage of the public broadcaster been in terms of equal access to opposition politicians? How fair has the system been in the run-up to the vote there?
I would say it's not fair at all. There is this legal requirement that the public service media have to give 5 minutes for every oppositional leading candidate. And for instance, the oppositional prime minister candidate Márki-Zay Péter just got his 5 minutes last week in the public service broadcaster, and he used this opportunity he brought a list regarding the governing parties' corruptional cases and other dodgy cases, and he just listed and said the things that he thought it would be important to hear for the audience who consume news through the public service media in Hungary. So it's not balanced at all. Mostly they're using experts who are part of the pro-governmental media conglomerate, for instance, through Keshma or through another organization called Megaphone, which the purpose of Megaphone is to spread the pro-governmental narratives through young people, through social media, and there are some experts, or how do we say, how should I call them? I think they call themselves political analysts, and the public service media uses these actors as political analysts regarding every political matter, not just the pro-governmental issues, but they making comments, very harsh comments regarding the united oppositional forces as well.
Yeah, I think I saw that for the interview, which was legally mandated with Mr. Makitsai, it was also broadcast at 7:55 a.m. in the morning. Obviously, yeah, burying it. So, I mean, yeah, this is all fascinating. And I guess, yeah, the control over the public broadcaster is one element of the kind of issue of media capture we've been discussing. The other, as I mentioned at the beginning, is what we've seen of kind of takeovers of independent media in Hungary over recent years as well. And obviously, this is something you've had experience with. So just to move on to the next kind of section, I was wondering if you'd just give us a brief overview of the story of Telex, how it came to be, and how things have sort of progressed since then. I wonder whether you've been able to grow, and what the climate like is right now for the economic base of this kind of independent journalism.
So yeah, Telex is a new organization, 1.5-year-old. Telex is a general interest news daily with one of the largest newsrooms in the country. We have around 70 journalists and editors, and we produce news and feature articles and videos, video documentaries, news videos, regarding everything what's happening and newsworthy in Hungary and outside of Hungary. For instance, we have now at the moment 4 reporters in Ukraine because we can spend the money for quality journalism, because we have the freedom, because of our business model, which based on readers' revenue. So basically, the majority of our income at Telex coming from the readers, who basically give donations to Telex just for its existing. And the thing why they do it, because all of us, the whole staff, used to work together to another news organization called Index, which in Hungary used to be the largest and most influential media outlet in the country. So everybody who wanted to know what's happening, they just clicked on Index and got unbiased, fact-based, independent news. But in 2020 July, the whole staff, more than 80 of us, resigned on the same day when our editor-in-chief, Szabolcs Dul, was fired. He's the current editor-in-chief at Telex as well. So we quit because there were a growing political influence on the newspaper. And after we quit, a couple of months later, it was basically bought by, Index was bought by a businessman who had open relationship to pro-governmental organizations. And we didn't want to work there and under political influence. So we decided to quit, and 9 weeks later we launched Telex, and we managed to stick together, and we managed to establish this new organization, which now sustainably working based on the donations of our readers. Which is extremely good to say, and it's a very good feeling that we do not belong to any kind of rich people with hidden agendas, or Telex is not owned by any oligarchs, which is very unique in Hungary. But our only function is to provide information for the public, which is not politically influenced. We managed to grow, even we are very small. We are still in the developing phase, and we have thousands of ideas how we will develop Telex. But what we did the last time we decided to start a new outlet in Transylvania, Romania, where there is a large Hungarian language minority. And there was another media outlet called Transindex, which hasn't got any relations to Hungarian Index where we work, but we had a good working relationship. And the Transindex staff, a couple of months ago quit because political influence, because there were also political influence on their newspaper. And when all of them decided to quit, we decided to establish a new media outlet called Telex. And Telex will be very shortly launched.
Yeah, I thought this was a fascinating story of the kind of the similarities between the two stories of how these news organizations were kind of born. So, I mean, how big will the new newsroom in Transylvania be? How many journalists are you able to keep on? And yeah, where do you think that can go?
So regarding Telex, I think the whole staff is around 10 people, and the new site is not launched yet, so it's under construction. Of course, there is a lot of things to do, but they are already started to write articles which are published on Telex and which is published on their Facebook page. We did the same when we quit Index, and we didn't have we didn't have a news portal. We wrote articles on Facebook, and we had 300,000 followers in a day, and then it just grows and grows, and now we have 600,000, and that's what Telex do as well. So they creating their audience now through social media, and also there is a crowdfunding again. For people who would like to, so the message is that people who would like to read fact-based news from Transylvania and from Romania in Hungarian language, they can contribute financially. And what we see, not just on Telex example, but on Telex's example, that people in Hungary, through this historical situation in the media sphere, they started to realize that they need to contribute, they need to step in if they would like to read a news daily or a news portal or anything. It's not just about Telex and Telex. As I mentioned, the Hungarian media sphere is extremely divided. So there is this large conglomerate which is pro-governmental, and the small number of outlets which can consider to be critical or independent from any kind of political forces. And there are a handful of us. It's not just Telex, but all of us who are in the same situation somehow relies on donations or subscriptions, so basically on the readers, because we cannot get that many, for instance, state advertisement. One of the largest actor in the Hungarian advertisement field is the Hungarian state itself, but they are cherry picking where they spend their money, and usually it's not the critical or independent outlets, and we also see on Telex we have advertisement revenue as well, but it can be said that there are some companies who are afraid to being shown on Telex or in other critical news sources.
Yeah, it's interesting how kind of through this kind of pressure from the state and from the government, independent media in Hungary have had to sort of evolve and adapt their business models to a subscription-based. And obviously now having this model in place, it kind of insulates you and others from this pressure linked to state advertising and taking money away and giving it kind of based on political lines. I understand that obviously part of the issue before at Index was that pro-government investors could start acquiring elements of around the newspaper, maybe not the newspaper itself, but shares in the kind of media ecosystem which it kind of had to exist in. So now with the subscription model, Telex seems to be insulated from these kinds of pressures. But I was wondering if your journalists or your newsroom still face other types of pressure, political pressure, smear campaigns, online harassment, this kind of thing, and how it's adapted to that as well.
The largest problem we face is access to information. So it's still, it was a large problem in the last decade, and still we face that as the largest problem, that state authorities very rarely answer our requests, answer our journalistic questions, or they do not promote their press conferences, and we just later find out that, for instance, there were the new president of Hungary had a press conference and some kind of press event, and we didn't know about it. We just found it out from pro-governmental organizations. Or there were occasions where we sent some requests regarding some very delicate stories to some kind of ministries in Hungary, and there was no answer. But then half a day later, we saw that there was an answer in the public, in the public service media, or in some of the pro-governmental media outlets, which was presented as an article, but clearly it was the propaganda answer for our questions that they didn't want to answer directly. Maybe they fear that we will have other questions regarding that. So access to information is our major problems. But we are being creative, and we have a very large variety of sources, background sources, and we basically go there everywhere with video cameras, and we ask questions on the street when the politicians or heads of authorities goes to work, and when they need to answer, or it's obvious if they don't want to answer, because we can show it, they are public figures, so we can approach them on the street, especially if they previously did not answer to our questions. So yeah, this is a major, large problem for us. You mentioned online harassment. This is also a thing that we somehow experience. There are some political influencers around the pro-governmental institutions. Mostly they are employed or somehow attached to this megaphone center I mentioned before, whose main operation is concentrated on the Hungarian language social media. And there were some occasions, it's not constant, but there were some occasions where critical journalists, not just from Telex, but from other outlets, were basically harassed online through posts or through private messages, so there are some occasions about it as well, that we have to used to it, basically, that this is happening.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that, for all the kind of systemic issues around media pluralism and concentration, that the day-to-day reporting of journalists in terms of access to information, being able to get public data, speak to politicians is really restricted as well. And that really affects journalists, on that kind of day-to-day level. So, I mean, I just had a couple more questions. The first would be, again, we're approaching the election. If there was to be a change in government, how easy or difficult do you think it will be in Hungary to kind of unravel the media capture and the entrenchment of Fidesz's power over media regulators, the public broadcaster, moving forward? What are some of the pitfalls you see there, and do you think it's actually possible?
I would think that it would be a really hard. I mean, I'm not a policymaker. I'm not a politician, so I only can share the fact-based infos regarding this. And is the media authority that I mentioned, the legislative body of the Hungarian media and public service media, and the head of this organization would be the same person for 9 more years. So that could be a difficulty if somebody would want to change anything in the country. The other issue is that these organizations, basically private organizations, private media organizations, I mentioned Keshma, this foundation, which could still be existed if the oppositional forces would win on the 3rd of April. So if they decide to continue their centralized communication, then they could do that. I mean, it's just a matter of money and a matter of decision. So it's really hard to say after this long period of time when the media, the critical media, is being expressed as basically the enemy, to say that what could happen if. But yeah, if the public service media would function as a public service media in balance and expressing every communities and every political sides which exists in the country, that would be a good start, I think.
And my last question was just around, kind of words of advice for others. So, I mean, we know that the model that Fidesz have created in Hungary over the last few years has been sort of copied to different extents by other EU member states. But as well, the kind of story of resilience of independent media in Hungary has also been, I think, a source of inspiration to others as well, to show that newsrooms can withstand pressure and be sort of reborn. So I just wanted to ask, what kind of some of the main takeaways or lessons that you learned from re-establishing Telex that you would say to other kind of independent media around Europe for kind of withstanding and then building back?
First of all, I do not see this as a fight against the government, because our main value is our impartiality. So I always refuse that somehow Telex or the critical media in Hungary is being seen as an activist kind of phenomena. But we just want to provide information to people, and we want it to continue. So it was a really easy decision. The hardest decision was to make it on the operational level. But I would say to others is that where similar regimes are in power, that they need to rely on the readers. They need to rely on their audience, and the citizens need to understand that newspapers or news portals are quite the same. So if you pay for the newspapers on the street, why you not contribute financially to the news consumption online? So it's a mindset question, I think, and not mainly for journalists and reporters and media leaders but for everybody who believes that in every democracy needs to have media pluralism and freedom of press.
I think those are some great words to end on there. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure, this has given lots of talking points and ideas for the panel coming up next on media capture around Europe. So thanks again, Veronika, for joining us, and thanks for your work.
Thank you very much.
afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. So this afternoon we've got the panel on competing models of media capture in Europe. So my name's Oliver Money-Curl. I'm the head of advocacy at the International Press Institute, and I'm delighted to be able to invite three very distinguished participants who are going to speak. First of all, we have Mikhail Klima, who is an extremely experienced journalist from the Czech Republic. He was formerly the head of the media group Ekonomia, head of Vltava Laba Media, and also a former candidate for the governing council of the Czech TV. Up until the end of January, he was also the former chair of the IPI's National Committee in the Czech Republic until he left us in order to join the current government as the advisor to the Prime Minister on media freedom and disinformation. So welcome, Mikhail. Secondly, we have with us Bojana Zambazova, who's a freelance journalist from Bulgaria, who reports on economic and political affairs and human rights, has been published in a variety of publications such as the New York Times, The Economist, Politico, etc. So welcome, Bojana. Thirdly, we are joined by Marius Dragomir, who's the director of the Centre for Media, Data and Society at the Central European University, where he has pioneered research into broadcast and digital media across Europe. He is also one of the leading thinkers about media capture in all its various guises, the models, the drivers, and hopefully some of the solutions to media capture. So welcome, everybody. Before we start, so what do we mean by media capture? Well, we usually hold Hungary up as the model, the standard model of media capture, where a government has used the powers of the state to create a pro-government media sector that dominates the information landscape. This usually includes factors such as the takeover of public service media, the takeover of regulatory bodies that oversee media regulators, for example, licensing bodies and competition authorities that approve media mergers. We see the use of the state's financial powers to reward positive coverage and to punish critical coverage by, for example, excluding certain media from state advertising funds or the provision of government subsidies to stewards towards pro-government media. And lastly, we also saw the ownership or takeovers of media, of significant media by political allies, and this might be with the assistance of state-backed banking loans, or in Poland's case, the use of a state-controlled energy giant to buy large expanses of media. An additional element of that would be very important to add the creation of a hostile environment for foreign investors in media in the country. So we've seen how this model has been perfected in Budapest and how it's been increasingly exported into neighbouring countries. The reports produced by IPI and the MFRR on missions to Poland and Slovenia, which are available for you to look into. But we've also seen that there's a classical model of media capture, and then there are variations on the theme. And today we're going to look at two of those variations on the Czech Republic and Bulgaria. They're particularly interesting because they both have their own unique versions of media capture. And they're also, interestingly, because they have new governments in place since the end of last year, have an opportunity to right some of the wrongs that have taken place over the last decade in each country. And that is what we will try to address in the second half of this debate. So first of all, I'd like to turn to you, Mikhail. And you've just authored IPI's report on media capture in the Czech Republic. So here you are. This is your opportunity to give us your idea of the key themes and elements of media capture in the Czech Republic. What were the sort of key elements that underlined the success of Andrej Babiš and his drive to power, and perhaps also what were the key weaknesses or his failures win total control over media? Thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you, Oliver. Can you hear me, see me? Yeah. Back to the report. The report describes the situation until our election, which was, as Oliver said, in the end of the year, or the new government is since the end of the year. So I will therefore speak separately about that facts which which remains and those which do not valid anymore. The fact which, of course, is still valid is that the market is dominated. The media market is dominated by oligarchs. By oligarchs, we mean people who are, or companies whose major business is non-media, and they are linked somehow with politics. We have two major commercial TV stations owned by oligarchs and three big publishing houses owned by oligarchs. And one of these media houses, publishing houses, is owned by Andrej Babiš, who was the prime minister of the country until last year. Also, we have several oligarchs owning media. Although we have several oligarchs, their positions is not really competitive because under the old government they were somehow relied on the prime minister, and the prime minister was not only the politician, but also the second or third richest and most influential businessman. So I think everybody can imagine that not to depend somehow on him is quite complicated. Concerning public media, we have both public TV and public radio. And the councils of these TV and radio are elected by the lower chamber of our parliament. The candidates for these seats are nominated by different non-governmental organizations, and from this nominates the parliament later votes the members of these councils, and we also have, if I'm speaking about the media scene, we have also two big publishing houses or media companies which are not oligarchs. One is Economia, the economic and business press publishing house, and one which is very significant and important to understand is Seznam, which is the media company which started as a search engine. You can imagine as a Czech Google. It still has a big portion of the market, big market position, probably even bigger than Google. And several years ago, they established also their own content production, so they are on the media market as well. And what is also interesting is that they are putting on their homepage, on their front page, they are putting articles from other media with links to the other media. So that way, they are on one side they are promoting the content of the media because they have the biggest traffic from the whole Czech internet. And at the same time, of course, they are profiting because they are selling advertising on this page. So they are doing both the good for them and also what is good for other media. So should I speak more or Oliver?
Hello, can you? Thank you. No, that's very interesting, Miko. You talked there particularly about the role of Seznam in helping promote the independent, the small independent media that have been created since the oligarchization of the mainstream media in the Czech Republic. And I think that's one of the common elements that we see in many of these countries that we are studying. We will come back to you, Mikhail, but what I propose in that case then is to go on to Bojana and ask you, Bojana, that I think Bulgaria is a particularly exceptional model of media capture. This is not media capture by a government, a party in government, or at least it's a media capture with a whole series of what appear to be vested interests, which are often extremely hard to define. Bojana and I have been working exceedingly hard over the last few weeks to finalise the report on media capture, and it's been exceedingly difficult, not least because of the opacity of information available about media ownership and media control and what is going on behind the scenes. So real lack of transparency, for me at least, seems to be one of the key distinguishing elements on Bulgaria. But Bojana, I hand the floor to you now.
Thank you, Oliver. I hope you hear me fine. Yes, indeed, you're quite right. While, let's say, with Hungary, Orban has become kind of the poster boy of not only a liberal democracy, but also of a media capture in the country, and kind of set the stage, for other, let's say, foreign leaders to follow. Even though one might argue that actually, the quest to capture Bulgarian media has started even before Orban took over in Budapest. But the picture in Bulgaria is much more complicated. As you mentioned, lack of transparency when it comes to responding the media, where the money is coming from, creates this opacity and this hidden network of vested interest, of proxies, of offshore companies, and that creates a very fertile ground to for local oligarchs to control the press and the media, and use it as tools to promote their own agenda, to trash competitors or political opponents. It's so in general, we can say that the media landscape in the past decade or so has been dominated by a few oligarchs who, under certain favors from the state, they were linked to the state, and they were ready to provide friendly coverage to whoever is in power. I interviewed some distinguished, editors and journalists in the country, and almost all of them basically mentioned that another instrument to kind of basically control the media agenda is also state funding, and sometimes, and quite often actually, using of EU funding to sponsor government-friendly media, papers, TV stations, etc. As each of the basically all the projects sponsored and funded by the EU have a budget for media promotion and communications, and sometimes their respective ministries are using this to channel them to certain publications. At the same time, as probably Marius will also speak about this a bit later, but the control over public media, some controversial appointment, has also been a reason for worry by media observers in the country. And in general, basically, the biggest damage that this kind of captured media landscape produced was lack of trust. So basically, Bulgarians do not really trust their press. and at the same time turning the media into, again, tools to discredit opponents, to smear investigative journalists who dare to reveal high-ranking corruption, etc., and civil rights activists, something that we've actually been seeing in Hungary, in the Czech Republic, etc. And maybe, well, there's a whole report of about 30 pages to read, so it's hard to sum up everything in 5 minutes. But basically, also this close ties between the state oligarchs who are controlling the media, and even some institutions were used to attack journalists and to prosecute them. And in recent months, we actually see some go as far as to say increase of libel cases, but basically using state institutions and defamation trials to further intimidate and threaten independent journalists. And before I wrap up, to kind of, the situation is quite grim, but there are some, vibrant surviving media who still strive to do, high quality journalism, the investigative journalism, and actually do what journalists and media are meant to do, and basically reveal wrongdoing, inform the public, and really be of service of people.
Okay, thanks for Boriana. I'll tell you what I'm going to come back to Mikhail now, because there are a couple of interesting points you touched upon, particularly the question of state funding of media and how that is used to impose some control on that. Now, in the Czech Republic, there are sort of two key areas. I know that, Mikhail, that you're currently researching or investigating some of this, and that's about how advertising was used to support pro-government media. And I think in the Czech Republic's case, there's a lot of evidence now to show that a lot of advertising was funneled directly towards Babiš's MFRR media that was owned by him through his agricultural firm Agrofert. So there's that element of the misuse of EU funds. But I also wanted to ask you about the question of how important it is for the oligarch media, so not just the MFRR media, but the Kretensky media and the Penta-owned media, the sort of the two other main ones, which have investments in other industries such as energy, such as finance, etc., agriculture, etc., and for those businesses to continue to be successful, they depend on close relations with the government. And I wondered if you could comment on those two aspects about how that control can be used to put soft pressure, perhaps, on media oligarchs. And I think lastly, perhaps you could comment on the whole conflict of interest problem in the Czech Republic, because Babiš himself was directly condemned by European Commission auditors for using EU funds. Boriana talked about the misuse of EU funds, about him as Prime Minister using EU funds to enrich Agrofert, but he also used, it would seem, Czech government funds to enrich MFRR media, at least the direct money in that direction. So I wonder if you could comment on those elements.
Yes, of course, the use of governmental funds to finance media is important topic and important matter. The problem in the Czech Republic is that probably differently from other countries, the system of usage of the governmental finances is very unclear. Yeah, which I can see even now when I am already for several months on the governmental side and trying to research where the money from which governmental organizations and ministries where are going, it's very hard to find, because it was never centralized and never seen centrally. But we know from individual cases that of course it's visible when the advertising are in the media, so we know that the governmental money under the last government were mostly used to advertise in the media company of Mr. Babiš and of a few other oligarchs. And of course, the new government wants to change this and use the money, the governmental money, to spread the money among all media sector, not only to individual media companies, which we just now will have a big challenge, because as you know, there is a Czech presidency starting in July. Of course, this is connected with advertising campaign of the government, and this is something which I am just now, from my new position, trying to save and to change the habit which were here in the government last time. And this is just exactly what I am doing in these days, by the way. So I very much hope that this era is over of misusing of the governmental money, and that in the next campaigns this will be, first it will be spread among all media, and second it will be and it will be seen who is getting what amount of money in what campaign.
Well, thank you, Mikhail. Well, we'll come back to the question about the Czech presidency of the EU right at the end, is what I'd like to do. I'll just go back to Bojana before bringing on Marius. You talked at the end of that about the important role of the independent media. And Mikhail has also talked about that and how they've survived, and the important role of Seznam particularly, which is a sort of this probably the largest digital media company in the Czech Republic, which is quite unique to the Czech Republic. And this has been a key platform for enabling small, versatile, flexible, but very high quality investigative journalism to be able to reach a broader audience. In Bulgaria, I'm not aware of a similar type of platform, but I wonder if you could comment a bit more about what is out there in terms of quality independent media, and then tell us a bit more about how some of the state institutions that you referred to have been in the past used to target some of the reporting. I'm thinking particularly after the banking crisis in 2014, there seemed to be a lot of prosecutions. It was like the Finance Services Commission was used to target a number of media that had exposed some embarrassing facts about who was behind the bank that collapsed, and what the possible causes were, and the possible corruption that was involved. So it appeared that the FSC had been weaponized to silence investigative journalism. And then likewise also, I mean, the general prosecutors have also targeted some of the leading independent voices. And then, of course, most recently, we have the investigative journalism group Bivol, which are facing a new slap or vexatious lawsuit for some 500,000 euros. So I'd be really interested if you could just sort of comment on that element of how state institutions are used, having been captured by political forces, let's call them, are being misused to target independent journalists.
Right. So basically, just to give you some background, in general, when it comes to online and print media, we're talking mostly about tabloid-style journalism filled with like hate speech towards minorities, foreign ethnic groups, the refugees, when the previous refugee crisis erupted some years ago. And again, some of these papers are used as a platform to tarnish those who they are challenging, those powerful. So in this climate, it's really hard for independent media who value good journalism to survive on market principles. So especially since all these other media, again, are either sponsored one way or another state or with the money of oligarchs who don't care. I mean, they're not there to make a profit out of this business, but to use it in for their own interest and gains. So for the handful of independent media, it's been a struggle basically since the fall of communism to stay afloat. There are some rays of hope to say there are new publications that are trying to be ad-free, entirely supported by the readers, etc., etc. But they're small, niche, and their reach is not so wild. And at the same time, one of the leading media groups called Economedia basically has been a constant target of vexatious lawsuits, libel suits, different fines, audits, etc., etc. For the past maybe 10 years. I think in one of their stories, they estimated that they've been a subject to around 100 trials and different checks by government institutions. A couple of years back, the publisher Ivo Prokopiev had like 2 trials against him that has nothing to do with the media business that he is owning, but media observers and reputable international media watchdogs actually were concerned that these are used again as a way to threaten him and to for him to take a note and his journalists of the topics they're covering. What Oliver mentioned earlier by the banking crisis, basically he's referring to the collapse of the 4th biggest bank at the time, and we're talking about 2014 when it went bankrupt and when basically one of the persons who has been described as a power broker and media mogul, Dedan Peevski, had a very public fallout with the majority owner of the bank, and then it turned out that the bank was actually sponsoring and giving loans to a lot of mainstream media. Some of them actually had to shut down after that. So the very few publications who managed to investigate and actually raise alarm about the corrupt practices in this bank were targeted by state institutions, including the antitrust commission, which is not a media regulator, but at the same time, the law allows it to fine publications if they deem that the information that they distribute is somehow manipulating the market. And using this as a reason, they basically slapped, so to speak, Economedia and a very small local publication, regional publication with extremely high fines, which later, some years later, were quashed by the courts. But at the same time, when we were talking with the owner, especially of the regional publication, she was saying that if they have to pay this amount of money, basically this means that their publication have to shut down. So that's this extreme. And just a quick note that let's say that on national level, media has been captured, but outside of Sofia, we even can speak of news deserts because since the fall of the Iron Curtain, it was especially difficult for independent journalists in the countryside to survive, and they've become like the ones who who are still doing journalism are again threatened, marginalized, etc., by the people that they're investigating or writing about. And those who kind of do what I call pseudo-journalism are often supported by city councils and the mayors in the towns that they are operating. So that's not really what reporters and journalists are supposed to, since they just repeat or offer a friendly view of what the local governments there are doing. So it's been extremely challenging.
Well, thanks, Bojana. I mean, of course, the subject of how do you fund local journalism is a problem that is being tried. People are trying to solve across Europe, across the world, in fact, because of that's more related to the general collapse of the sort of economic media model. And I think that will be a subject of the next panel later this afternoon, but it's important you raised it. I think the question of the way the courts or the specific institutions have been used to target journalism is particularly acute in Bulgaria. Of course, slaps is a growing phenomenon. Many countries we see this, particularly I think in Poland is another country where the authorities have used the courts to intimidate investigative journalism. This doesn't seem to be quite so much the case in the Czech Republic, and perhaps even less so in Hungary, although we do know that some of the independent media are targeted in the courts. But it's also interesting that you say that despite the targeting, most of the time the media have won their cases, so that's obviously a positive thing that shows that the courts are not have not themselves been captured, even if certain elements may have been. But that's really useful. Listen, I want to bring in Marius now, because Marius, of course, is the authority on this subject, and I think it's your 2019 paper that identified 4 key sort of identifiers for media capture, so that people can try to measure the level of media capture in a country, perhaps also for in investment purposes. So you talked about the control of media regulators, the control of public media, misuse of public funds to control media, and the control of private ownership. So I wonder, Marius, if you could come in and tell us a little bit more about that, and also to sort of comment on how you see as what are distinguishing elements that we see in the Czech Republic and in Bulgaria, and how that perhaps requires a different response, a different understanding, and a different response from us. So Marius, please.
Sure. Yes. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. Well, I'm not sure whether I'm on authority, but I was proud some years ago with a study that we released where we described the media capture phenomenon, and I remember that a friend on Facebook wished me to lose my job, which was a good wish. She thought that at the time when these things will not appear, I will have nothing to write about. But going back to the model that we described, that's something that we found in various countries as the key areas that lead to the capture, and we designed these metrics because as a research, but also as a journalistic tool to kind of measure the threats and also the opportunities for example, for some media companies that are threatened with a higher level of capture to exit at the right time, because if they don't, they will be pushed out and sell their outlets at a much lower price. This is why we looked at that, and indeed, if you use that model, I think you can find the most extreme cases in our world, in our part of the world. Hungary is the most extreme case, and I know that we had Veronika Munk from Hungary speaking about that. In Hungary, you have all these elements, and that is the level of capture that leads to a major shrinking of the space for independent journalism, which is what we in fact care about. But I wanted to make 2 points. First of all, is the fact that media capture doesn't mean necessarily full control. And again, if you look at the Hungarian case, the oligarchy class that was in fact created by Fidesz and the prime minister is not pushing to taking over all the media in the country. In fact, they are very skillful in measuring how many outlets and what kind of coverage they need to win the elections. So this is one thing. But at the same time, yes, to have capture, you need quite a high level of control. You cannot just control a few media outlets to be able to ensure, for example, victory in the next elections. So this is just a general point, because sometimes some people feel that you must have everything controlled, or others think that if you control just a few printing houses, you have capture. The capture is the situation as you all described it, where you, for a journalist, for an independent journalist or media outlet, is in fact quite difficult to operate, and even if they operate, their impact on the market is very limited. That being said, talking about the two cases, I think what I picked up from the reports and the talks from Michal and Boriana today were a few things. I think, yes, indeed, the classic example where you check all the points, I think, is the most detrimental and the most dangerous for independent journalism, simply because you push independent journalism to the fringes, but also because that kind of model ensures the access of oligarchs and political powers to resources for a long period of time, and that means that you prolong the capture for a long period of time, and that means many things. That means that you manipulate the audience, that you have a huge impact of the audience over a long period of time, and that doesn't solve it. That is not going to be fixed afterwards very quickly. So it has really long-lasting consequences. Speaking on that, then, and moving on to the examples that were discussed today, I think Czech Republic, which in fact in the some 2 decades ago was an example of a thriving media scene with a lot of foreign investors and independent journalism, it was quite expected, at least for myself, who in fact happened to live in the Czech Republic at the time. It was quite unexpected to see that danger in the country, because exactly of that reason, because you had diversity, pluralism, you had a lot of foreign investors. But the two key events that led to the capture, which was the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, and the exit of the foreign investors from the region, including the Czech Republic, I think were fundamental factors in actually triggering a form of capture, of media capture in the Czech Republic. The good thing about that is that there are a few mechanisms to fight that, the full capture, so to speak. One is, and they were mentioned by Michal in this debate, one is the quite prominent role of the civil society in appointing various boards of regulators and public service media. I would add also the fact that you have a few large players that Michal spoke about that are not so vulnerable to capture. So it's essential in the market to have that. If you have that, it's quite difficult to achieve the full media capture. And also I will add, as an observer of the public media in the Czech Republic, the rather good quality of the public media in the country, the strong opposition of its management during the years against politicization, although they were not always successful. So that is also an element, because taking over the media, taking over the public media is an essential component of the capture, and we saw that happening in other countries. Moving on to Bulgaria, it's also a very interesting case. Bulgaria was always, even before the financial crisis, struggling with these attempts to politicize. It was struggling with I think, eternally with the lack of transparency in the media market, and it is a very interesting case because it is a variation where you have this multi attempts of capture, more oligarchs actually trying to get the attention of the government, which doesn't mean that it's great. Of course, it's a variation that affects independent journalism, but it doesn't have the negative impact that you had in Hungary, where you have, in fact, the full media market and the government working towards the same media capture goals. So just to sum up, I think yes, the extreme examples are the most damaging to independent journalism, and here we can refer to countries outside the European Union. Turkey is another example where they do exactly what you do in Hungary, and they adding also violence and aggression against journalists, which is even worse. And you have other countries looking and trying to import the model from Hungary, but at the same time, the variations, as we call them, the crossbreeds and the inbreeds, are equally bad for journalism, I think, because they all affect the Independent Reporting Act. What you can do about that's probably the theme for another debate, but I think it's very important to push back against policies and regulations that lead to that, and that was the signal that the media scene triggered in 2010 when Viktor Orban won the elections, and the first thing he did was to adopt the problematic media law. Everybody warned about that and warned the EU about that, and nobody paid attention. And once you lose control over that process, it's finished in 4 years. And I think, and this pushback, I think, should come from the industry, from the news industry. Journalists should actually speak against that as soon as that happens. And I think at the moment, for example, the most relevant discussion that is taking place is the attempts by governments to take over the internet and to control the internet. That's going to be the big fight over the next years. And I think the journalistic community should respond to that very vigorously. EU, of course, has to be more involved and has to use a lot of mechanisms against that. I think they failed miserably 10 years ago in the Hungarian case and later on in the Polish case. And of course, when it comes to independent media, for those who are able to do that, for those who support and invest in media outlets, I think definitely supporting and launching new outlets is very important. But also very, very important is to, when you look at media capture cases, to focus on vulnerable outlets, those that are that can be bought any minute by oligarchs and be reduced, to a propaganda channel. So that's those with funds to invest and those in the media development sector who want to support independent journalism in the region, I think should focus on these outlets because they are in most danger.
Thanks, Marius. You've already jumped well ahead of us by giving us some of the solutions to the problems. I think one of the key points that you made, and I remember this from hearing you speak before, is the question of the dangers of media capture is you put in place the situation for years and years and years. You can have it could take almost an entire generation to turn things around. And for those who listened to Veronika Munk earlier, reflecting about the challenges that might face an incoming government to turn things around in Hungary. Well, you've got very well placed private media under control, the media council under control, the public service media under control. How quickly can you actually sort of turn that around whilst also respecting democratic norms, rule of law, etc., etc.? So I think I will come back now. We've got about 5 minutes left, but I will extend that for at least another 5 minutes. And before I forget, if there are any questions from the audience out there that you want to pose, please post them. They come up in the chat. I can see them, you can't. But if there is time, I will then bring them in at the end. But I will come back to Mika. Mika, you are in a unique position. Not only have you sort of written and commented and advocated on this issue over many years, but you are now having, I think, before the election with colleagues set out what you thought were the media reform priorities for the incoming failure government. Now you're in a position to help implement that. So how do you see the challenges? What is realistic in terms of what the government can achieve in the coming months and years? And what is it they ought to prioritize in order to, as we say, the sort of build the defenses against future attempts of media capture?
Yeah, well, we are doing already several matters. First of all, we, of course, stopped discrimination of different media and journalists from access to press conferences and governmental information, which the previous government did. So now everybody is invited to the press conference. The journalists of all media are joining politicians on their foreign visits and so on. We are just now giving to the parliament the change of the TV and radio laws, so that the members of the council will be more representative and competent. We are changing also the law in the way that there will be not only one chamber, the lower chamber, but also the Senate responsible. So the members of the council will be elected, part of them by lower chamber, part of them by the Senate. As I already said, we are changing the policy of the planning of advertising, so that the advertising will be planned to much more media than before, not discriminating any political orientation. And the last matter I want to mention just now is the countering disinformation, which is a quite a serious problem in the Czech Republic. And of course, this is of course big challenge, because at the same time we don't want to anyhow to break the media freedom. So we have to find the solution how to stop or limit the propaganda coming from Russia, and at the same time not limit the press freedom.
Well, thank you, Mikhail. You've opened up a whole new box of discussion there about how we fight disinformation. And of course, that's incredibly topical, and we're all struggling with a way to know how to respond to that. Okay, let's move to Bojana. I think in the report you quote the new Prime Minister as wanting to make sure that no media or the money received from government to any media is completely transparent, so that no media is sort of controlled in the background by media. That's obviously an incredibly important reform, and you touched upon the abuse of EU funds and other funds. So that is an attempt to deal with one element of it. But is that enough? And what more must be done? And does the government does it understand the challenges before it? In order to be able to really take on this issue? What would you advise?
Well, it's $1 million question, whether the government will be willing to push forward such like media reform that obviously is much needed. In a country like Bulgaria, where media freedom has been under threat for decades, basically. So I would say it's a mixed bag so far. Just to paint a picture of how the new government took over, basically it ended the third term of former Prime Minister Boyko Borisov, whose central right Ger party dominated basically the Bulgarian landscape for more than a decade. And so some people saw, having a new government which run on anti-corruption promise as a hopeful development. But so you're right, Oliver. On the one hand, we have the Prime Minister in January basically saying we want to make this process transparent. We want people to know how state or EU money are being spent, whether they're channeled to certain media outlets, and how everything is happening, basically. So far we haven't seen any of this data being publicly released, at least. And yes, given what's happening in Ukraine, let's say that there are more urgent matters that dominate the political agenda. But at the same time, it's a four-party coalition, and two of the coalition partners are actually known for some controversial statements made about media or even like threatening journalists in the past. So there's that domestic factors that maybe should be considered. And also, media reform were actually nowhere to be found on the agenda or during the election campaign of the party of the new prime minister. And, as we mentioned, the lack of transparency, the EU funding, smear campaigns, the tabloidization of the media, etc. There are a lot of big problems to tackle. So it will be a challenge, as Marius was saying, for any government to undo basically this kind of pattern that has been created over the past decade. And one would think that the new cabinet will maybe start to tackle some of these big issues. Instead, what is the parliamentary committee in charge of media and culture doing? The first bill that they proposed, basically one of the very first bills, was to appoint a policeman to guard the actual building of the Bulgarian state agency. I mean, that doesn't, I don't know. So my point, I guess, that I'm trying to make is they are promising and they're saying that media freedom is important to them, but so far, unfortunately, we haven't seen any major steps in this direction. And again, there are a lot of issues to be addressed and to make sure actually that some of the oligarchic control that we've seen in the past won't return. We don't have time to go into details, but there were quite some ownership shifts in Bulgarian media market recently, and moves and changes that will ensure, again, transparency, allocating money in a public and transparent way, and not weaponizing state institutions to intimidate journalists, etc., are important steps to make sure, again, that these old models are not having a comeback in any form or shape.
Okay, thanks, Bojana. It does seem to be a habit of whenever there's a new Bulgarian government, they come in on a reforming corruption or ending corruption platform, and then 10 years later the next government wants to do exactly the same. But it does seem, in Bulgaria at least, the priority, I would have thought, has to be transparency, getting the information out there, making it available, because without that you don't know who is pulling the strings, and that seems to be the key story in your case. Listen, I was going to go to Marius next, but in fact I'm going to fast forward to Mikhail, because I know that you have to go, and I really wanted a last comment from you, Mikhail. In July, your government takes over the EU presidency for 6 months, and the government has already declared that media freedom will be at the centre of the agenda, of the presidency's agenda. Could you perhaps elaborate in a few words what that will mean and how you expect that to roll out for us, what we can look forward to?
Yeah, well, very briefly, the idea is to show that the new government has different priorities, and that the freedom of speech is one of our priorities, one of the priorities of this government. So we want to include the media freedom on the agenda as well as with other topics which were already prepared. But frankly, the Russian invasion to Ukraine just now stopped the other agenda. So we are just now delayed in that, and I hope that we will come back soon and prepare some kind of events, conferences maybe. But as I said, it was just now stopped for the last 3 or 4 weeks because of the Russian invasion. So let's hope that the situation will be better soon, and that we will have a chance to come back to the normal agenda, because as you may know, the Czech government is very much involved in helping Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government to in their fight against Russian invasion.
That's quite right. I mean, of course, all of our agendas have been totally turned upside down by the war in Ukraine, and it is hard to focus on these things. But I know that you've been involved, and the National Committee and the NFNZ have been involved in raising a lot of money available for Ukraine journalists. So that's really important to remember. Look, I will turn lastly now to Marius. And ask you, I mean, you talked already a few minutes ago about some of the sort of practical things that can be done at a national level. But the European Commission, which I think has struggled in recent years to understand the severity of the threat of media capture. You talked about the Hungarian media law and how it was all wished away by the policymakers in Brussels. But we do see a sea change over the last 1 or 2 years. The sort of pressure that the Commission has been prepared, the sort of political will, if you like, to take on Hungary and Poland over rule of law issues is clearly being put on the top of the agenda. Okay, there may be some compromises now because of the war, but nevertheless, that remains, I think, a fundamental element. And one of the policy issues that we see coming out of it is this European Media Freedom Act that was announced last September. The public consultation on that is underway, and the deadline is tomorrow for that. A draft directive is expected to be published by the summer, or quite speedy in theory. But I wonder if you could comment on what you expect might be in that, and what you would hope to be in that, and what kind of tools can the Commission sensibly acquire to deal with the questions raised by media capture. And I'm talking about things like the transparency of media ownership, the use and misuse of government funds to discriminate against critical media and reward positive or pro-government media, and the question of regulatory independence. I think that's a really key issue when you have a media council that's been totally taken over by the government of the day or the party of the day. How do you allow what is not, what is a captured regulator to act and as if it were independent? So really, your comments on that would be really good way to sort of draw this to an end, please, Marius.
Sure. Well, I think.
Can I just interrupt you? I'm very sorry. I have to go and leave the session. So please accept my apology and thank you to everybody.
Thank you for joining us, Mikhail. Thank you.
All
Bye-bye.
the best.
Speak soon. Marius.
Yeah, very briefly, I think the act that you are talking about and the work of the European Commission over the past few years are really commendable. Unfortunately, they came too late, and I think we have to really put everything in the war in Ukraine context today, because it is having a huge impact on the media industry, especially in the Central and Eastern European part of the world. There are things that are totally unrelated with the action of the Commission in several countries. We have spoken to various media outlets that have received strong signals from advertisers that they are going to slash the budgets because of the ongoing and upcoming crisis that they are expected. So I think we are expecting very soon, regardless of whether the war will expand to Europe or not, I think we are looking at another turning point in the overall media developments in Europe. I think because of this war, and we already see those signals, I think many countries are going to step up their influence in the media, the government's role in the media. We see how narratives are being realigned with how the governments think about the war, and I'm sure you have seen that in one of the few European Union countries, in Hungary, the pro-governmental media took a pro-Russia, a blatantly pro-Russia approach, which is due to the political links between the two countries. Not going into that, but I think these are major developments, and we have to put that into perspective. And the actions of the Commission will depend, unfortunately, on all those. I really believe that yes, all the things that you mentioned, transparency of media ownership and the sources of funding coming from the government, they have to be in. But the most important mechanism to actually rein in these governments from media capture is the financial mechanism, which was almost there before the war started. We were talking about including that mechanism, but I think that's the only way to actually force these governments to take any measures in anything. If that is not going to be there, I think nothing will really be achieved.
Okay, look, Maris, thank you very much for that. Listen, I have just received the sort of red warning sign that we're about to be cut off and that we've exhausted our time. But I don't apologise, because I think this has been an absolutely really fascinating conversation. I hope our audience have found it too. But thank you to Mikhail, who has left us. Thank you to Maris and to Bojana for this. And don't forget, the reports will soon be available on the MFRI website. They are available with IPI, and check our Twitter account. Good luck for the rest of the conference, everybody, and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.
Hi.
Hi, good to see you again.
Hello.
Hello. Good, we are all here, I see. Okay. Good. So let me start. It's 15:30. So good afternoon to everybody. Welcome on the panel called Home Ground Supporting Local Media. My name is Lucie Sikorova. I am the chair of the supervisory board of ECPMF and local journalist based in Czech Republic. And I have the big pleasure to moderate this panel. I look forward very much to hear contributions of our great guests who are very well informed on what's going on in local journalism. Of course, we are all of us very following the situation in Ukraine and thinking how we can help refugees, but let's concentrate for a moment on our homegrown issues too, which shouldn't be just forgotten either. So please allow me to introduce our speakers. We have here Professor Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen, the director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and professor of political communication at the University of Oxford. Welcome. Then our next speaker is Maria Francesca Rita, the researcher at OBCT, Osservatorio Balcani Caucaso Transeuropa. Sorry for my pronunciation. She is one of the curators of the Resource Center on Media Freedom in Europe and researcher for the Media Freedom Rapid Response. Our next speaker is Julia Hildebrand, the project leader of the Privacy First software and community project for local media called BIAB. Our fourth speaker is Anya Pasky. I hope the pronunciation is so far okay. And she's the press spokesperson of the German Association of Digital Publishers and Newspaper Publishers, BDZV in Berlin, and as well as managing director of the Journalist Award of the Digital Publishers and Newspaper Publishers, Theodor Wolf Award. So later we will be joined by Hanna Supa, the editor-in-chief of Leipziger Volkszeitung, but she will join us later with a case study. So welcome once more here, and I would like to start this panel as we don't have that much time and great speakers, so use the time and so go straight to our guests. I would like to start with Professor Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen. Your work focuses on changes in the news media, on political communication, and the role of digital technologies in both of them. In 2015, you published a book called Local Journalism, The Decline of Newspapers and the Rise of Digital Media. In this book, you analyzed major challenges the 21st century has brought for local journalism. So please allow me just a short quotation. The newspaper industry that has historically provided most local coverage is in decline, and it is not yet clear whether digital media will sustain new forms of local journalism. This book presented a multifaceted portrait of precarious present and uncertain future of local journalism. So this was 2015, and just a few years later, Victor Picard, the associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania, went even further. In his predictions for journalism in 2020, he claimed that the commercial era for local journalism is over. A viable business model for local news no longer exists, and journalism shouldn't be seen as a business, but as a public service. So I would like to ask you, Mr. Professor, do you agree with that? And how do you see the present and the future of local journalism nowadays, 7 years after you published this earlier mentioned book? So I would give you the floor now.
I think that local journalism can take many different forms and also be based on many different funding models. I would say I think we should sort of start with the observation that in most of the world, the clear majority of local journalism is funded by private for-profit enterprise. And while there are a few countries in which non-profit local journalism and or genuine independent public service local journalism are important supplements to the work of private for-profit publishers, historically mostly local newspapers, even in the countries where these supplements are most robust and most impressive, the United States for non-profit journalism at the local level, a few of the German-speaking countries in Northwestern Europe, in the case of genuine independent public service media, they are supplements to something that historically has been in the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century based on private enterprise. Victor is right to argue, as I have argued too, and many other observers of the news industry, to point out that business is very challenged. The move from a low choice environment where local publishers have very high market power over advertisers to a high choice environment in which local publishers have almost no market power over local advertisers has very severely disrupted what used to be essentially something that was sort of close to local monopolies or local oligopolies when it came to advertising. Audience attention is moving elsewhere and comes online. In a few countries like the UK and the US, we have good data on this, and the share of attention that goes to news is just a few percent of the time people spend with digital media, and local news is just a small fraction of that, just 1/6 in the US and 1/10 in the UK. So well less than 1% of all time spent online is spent with local news. And of course, advertisers who fundamentally want to buy audiences' attention are going where they can find that attention and are buying advertising that is cheap, targeted, and at large scale, primarily via large platform companies, including Facebook and Google, putting tremendous pressure on the business of local news as we knew it in the 20th century. So I don't think that fundamental challenge has changed since I edited that book some years ago. I think it's only grown more pronounced. Print readers are literally dying off, and digital is a much more competitive and very challenging business for local news providers. I'm glad to say that I think there has been, in an overall environment of tremendous challenges, having very real and severe consequences for investment in local journalism, and that's leaving aside entirely the whole question of media capture and the role of politics and politicians in different parts of the world, and just focusing on the business side of this. That there's also, I think, been some encouraging developments that have really come to fruition in the years since we worked on that book. Part of it is about legacy local newspaper publishers who, in some cases, I think have really leaned into a digital transition and shown that they can continue to serve their existing audience while also developing digital offers that make sense. In West France, for example, the regional in the case of France, for example, the regional newspaper West France by now has I think almost 160,000 digital subscribers. And I'm sure Anya will talk about the success of some publishers in Germany, and Hannah as well, of course, who's one of the pioneers and leaders in this space. So some local legacy publishers, not all, but some, I think, are doing well. Others are being asset stripped by owners who are maximizing short-term profits and essentially pumping the well dry without investing in digital or the future of the titles that they have the honor of owning. We're also seeing, I think, some really interesting experiments in digital-born local news. It's a very challenging environment, there's no question about that, and new startups are not exempt from the business pressures that legacy players face. They have advantages as well as disadvantages, but I think we are seeing some interesting initiatives from a wide range of different actors. We're seeing newsletter-based publications signing up large numbers of paying subscribers in the case of the Manchester Mill here in the UK. There are organizations that are based on membership and a sense of community. The Bristol Cable here in the UK is an example of that. There are also some digital-born local sites that are primarily based on advertising from local advertisers who see that they stand out from just another Facebook ad if they advertise with, for example, Lincolnite in the northeast of England. So I think we are seeing some various encouraging sort of new titles grow up, and we're also seeing some of the big players in digital journalism, such as Axios in the United States, going into local news through local newsletters that they've launched in a number of cities in the US after buying the title in Charlotte. So I think we are seeing some green shoots here. It doesn't change the fact that the business is very challenging, and it doesn't change the fact that I would say that if we think about which parts of journalism that are most challenged from a commercial point of view, I think local news is probably amongst those. And of course, that does raise the question of whether some form of public policy intervention could be a good idea. Though again, the extent to which each of us individually believe that is likely to happen or a desirable thing to happen depends a lot on what we think of elected officials and politicians in the country we're in. In some countries, journalists and members of the public may have reasonably high confidence that broad-based political support can be provided for providing public support for genuine and independent local news. In other countries, perhaps journalists and members of the public might suspect that anything that purports to be support could in fact be instruments of media capture, as I think we have seen in some member states of the European Union. Mm-hmm. So I think the analysis we offered back in 2015 holds up. I'm hardly impartial on that, I suppose. And that the challenges we identified have only intensified, but I'm glad to say I also think that some of the signs for optimism we've seen have also, I think, bloomed and grown in the years since.
Thank you very much for actually quite an optimistic starting word. And let's see what other speakers have to add. Then later, when we have a space for questions, I have one quite a big question which I would like to ask you. So hopefully we will have time for it. Thank you for now. And I would go to Maria Francesca Rita. At the moment, you are working on an analysis on the needs of women and local journalists and the support that is offered to them in Europe. And you can now already present the results of 2 of these case studies of the needs and gaps. And to be concrete, it's from Italy and Ireland. So please, I would like to give you the word and space now to present it. Curious to see.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. Good afternoon, all. So on this occasion, we will try to address the question, are local journalists protected? These needs and gaps analysis is following another study that we published in 2021. And we developed 4 case studies to analyze the condition of local and women journalists and the support they receive both at the national and international level. First of all, with the term local journalism, we refer to all the print, broadcast, and online media that operate at a subnational level, so regardless of their dimension. Local journalism is rarely in the spotlight. However, in recent times, attention is growing, and it is interesting to see that also in relation to the impact of the pandemic, of the economic impact of the pandemic, this attention to the local dimension is growing. One of the biggest challenges for local journalism in these days is the digital transition. And this digital transition is leading to new models of online local information. Among these, we can identify, for example, some hyper-urban websites or new models of local investigative journalism, but also forms of local journalism which is in strong connection with local governments. But still, local journalism plays a really important role for local communities, first of all, in the dimension of trust. In a time where misinformation and disinformation are so widespread, local communities tend to consider local news as more trustworthy. And even more important is the fact that local journalism holds local administrations accountable. So local journalists are, first of all, very well known in their local community, and so they are more visible. And this has both some pros and cons. On the one side, as we can see from this excerpt from an interview, everybody knows you, and this has an advantage, for example, when you have to obtain some information. But on the other hand, if someone doesn't like your story, they can come directly to you. Therefore, local journalists are more exposed to threats from both the local and non-local actors. And what is more, this vulnerability is often confronted with authorities that have a less experience. And there is also a lack of activities from unions and support centers and media lawyers. So we'll present the results for the Italian case, first of all. In Italy, local newspapers and television are the first source of news in 14 regions out of 20. So it's a really important dimension. One of the pressing problems in the Italian context is the intertwining of the business world, criminal organizations, and local administrations. And this is, of course, a problem with strong repercussions for local reporters. Media outlets, due to economic restrictions, are less and less able to cover local issues, and therefore local reporters are increasingly working as freelancers or even bloggers. So they are kind of left alone in this fight, but we believe they should be listed among the human rights defenders for their commitment to expose political wrongdoings in difficult territories. As one interviewee told us, they are actual outposts of civil resistance. What is really lacking at the local level in Italy is solidarity from colleagues. This is something that was highlighted also by Roberto Saviano in the keynote address for this summit. On the territory, you will never get any kind of solidarity, and the opposite phenomenon occurs. So there is a really dangerous process of delegitimization of the journalist that is attacked or under threat. Looking at the support, media lawyers usually overlook local journalists because they need to focus on mediatized or strategic cases. But we believe, of course, that they should not overlook local journalists because they are in dire need of support. Looking at the institutional support, there is this Parliamentary Anti-Mafia Commission, which is a fundamental actor for the monitoring of the condition of journalists threatened in Italy. Moving to Ireland, the local dimension of journalism is not as extensive as in bigger countries, but we identified 3 areas of difficulties, which are defamation law, the precarious economic conditions, and the digital safety. As one interviewee told us, the legal system is weaponized against the press. And of course, the local newspapers are more vulnerable to defamation laws. And the effect of this vulnerability is a potential chilling effect. And a local journalist could be overly cautious to the point that he would avoid the risk at all and not report about that issue. The lack of investments put a lot of pressure on local journalists, and local media outlets are increasingly becoming a sort of PR agencies, as was described by many interlocutors. This relationship with public authorities is tight, and of course this is detrimental for the right to be informed of local communities. As one interviewee told us, local journalism is not as sharp as it should be. The last issue in the Irish landscape is the visibility. As we said in the beginning of this presentation, visibility is higher in person, but it is lower on social media. And this represents a risk in the case of online harassment. For example, we had a talk with a well-known Irish journalist who told us that after she became very vocal about her case of online harassment, social media companies intervened. And she said that if she had worked in a regional paper, she's sure that they would have not suspended the accounts that were harassing her. So we believe that in the Irish context, there is a lack of attention towards journalists in general, and specifically at the local level, more attention, more training opportunities should be provided. So my last recommendations are, first of all, it is fundamental to foster solidarity with local journalists because they are often, really often left alone. And it is important to establish connection with the international level and local level and national level, Second, we should not overlook the local level because the vulnerability is also due to this lack of visibility. And finally, it is important to increase the provision of training opportunities related to all the safety issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Unfortunately, I think we all in other countries can just confirm your findings, which is not very optimistic at a basic, but there are, of course, also some good examples, as Rasmus mentioned at the beginning already. And I would, of course, have a question to you too, but first, just give a word to our other two speakers. I would like to go to Julia now, and just we all know that the media plurality is very important for maintenance of democracy. Already, Rasmus mentioned at the beginning already, there's the dangers of media ownership concentration. So this means the knowledge that to have diverse small media outlets, especially on local level, it's there. But how can these small projects survive? What is important for them? I would like to ask Julia, who is leading a project focused on this small local media, which includes also developing a special software for them called BRB. Could you just introduce us briefly the BRB software and share some of your insights from the local media community?
Yes, thank you, Lucy, for inviting me to this discussion. Maybe first of all, briefly, where BRB is based. So I'm working actually with Correctiv, which is one of the first non-profit newsrooms in Germany. And at the core of what Correctiv does is really investigative journalism. So we do a lot of collaborations on that as well, cross-border investigations, but also working together in a big network with local news and or newsrooms and local journalists on investigating different issues that you can address on the local and on the national level. So the most recent one that got published that you might like to take a look at was about experience of women in Germany who are looking for abortion. And a bit surprising there was that Germany is maybe not as progressive in that issue as you would think it is. So that's what Correctiv in general does, but Correctiv really aims to work in a much broader context for strengthening an open and democratic civil society. And that's how I got a job here, though I'm not an investigative journalist and not working in this area, but I've got a background in product development and have been working in community building with newsrooms like Deutsche Welle, but also social enterprises and local communities. So what I'm concerned with really at Correctiv is offering a solution to the crisis that Lucy just mentioned and that Rasmus actually summed up, I think, pretty nicely. And the biggest issues, Lucy, you just said it, plurality and diversity. Plurality, really too few players that we are getting the information from. Very few people own the media that also, especially on a local level, then there are a few big media organizations that own all the local newspapers. So we have that, I think, as well, all across Europe. And when it comes to diversity, we really have a lack of it in terms of representation of people of different backgrounds, of different age, of different background than the editors in the newsroom. That's where it starts with. So we really need more diversity there. And connected to both of those is, of course, also the trust crisis that we have. And I would say that it's not just a trust crisis in terms of the people not trusting the media, but also the other way around. Like our journalists and media not really trusting the people. And
So you developed this great BRB platform, actually, or software, practically. What is it for, or what can local media use it for? It's supposed to be open source.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to come to that now because the solution that we really put forward is one of the ones that Rasmus mentioned. Like he said, membership models are one of the kind of bright spots in this crisis. And the Bristol Cable is one of the examples in the UK who are running this kind of model. So really a model where the community is put at the heart of how journalism is done. So working together with them, not journalists being gatekeepers anymore, but journalists really being moderators of discussion, being facilitators of different voices in the community. So that's what the Bristol Cable is a really good example for. And we were lucky enough to have them on board as well, actually, for this project. We're working together on a software solution that allows newsrooms to run this community-centered model, but at the same time also not being stuck with just making journalism a hobby in the end, because that's what happens as well a lot on the local level, that people are just volunteering for this work, that they are just doing it in their free time. But the only way forward is really if we also change that and really make it self-sustainable and help them to run business models. And membership model is one of those as a part of a diversified revenue stream. And when it comes to the software we are building, it's really about allowing newsrooms to do both of those things. So setting up their membership model, working together with their communities, starting with simple things like just having integrated service in their own system, and really understanding who their communities are and how to work together with them, understanding who are the experts in my community that I could, what's the expertise that I could tap into in my community, but also really building these strong relationships with my community members, which can start with how do I welcome people into the community and helping them to do that with a digital tool. So technology has really been a big barrier for those first pioneers who've been running this model and being successful. And what most of them do then is they just build it themselves in some way with the little money that they already have. So they try to build that technology. So that's why we got together also with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, Correctiv, and the Bristol Cable and said, can we pool that energy and also the money and just build something that we can all benefit from, and that allows us all to build these newsrooms. And I really strongly believe that the solution to this big crisis is not in saving journalism and saving the media as it is, or as it was, but in really creating an infrastructure where these small media organizations can thrive and can get started. We need more startups, we need more new ideas, and we need hundreds and thousands of those. So we need to build that infrastructure really to make that happen.
And thanks very much for the first step you made in this. Thanks for explaining what you did till now, and good luck for this, for all of us in this for the future. And it's a good opportunity to bridge over to Anya Pasky. I'm sorry. I would like to ask, Julia already mentioned it's not easy at all to be a local journalist, and BDZV, which you represent, was interested into the ECPMF study Findable Journalists, which presented threats which are journalists facing while doing their job, like insults, intimidation, even physical attacks. So it's not only about money, but also these challenges. So how do traditional media, your members mainly, ensure that in these challenging times that the job is still attractive for journalists who want to provide quality and critical journalism? And if you could just mention briefly, what are the main challenges for this media to still be able to fulfill their role?
Yeah, perhaps first I would like to point out there's a time before and a time after. When we asked ECPMF to do the Feindbild study number 6 together, there, of course, we hadn't known about the war in Ukraine. And I think this puts sheds a new light on everything we are doing. But going back to the time before the 24th of February, I could join in with my colleague from Italy in pointing out the problems for local journalism, especially where the dangers are. The dangers are, and how to win, especially young people, for local journalism. That's really today also a question of how the public reacts to them. On one hand, there's the money to win. I think being from an association that gives labor, There's quite a lot to win in journalism still, and it's quite an interesting job to do and a challenging job to do. But nevertheless, today, our young journalists tell us it's difficult. It's difficult to get people to answer. It's difficult to, they are scared to confront people, especially in local journalism. Our young ones are today perhaps a bit more smooth than the young ones 20 or 30 years ago. And so our job description is changing. It gets more technical, of course, but in the end, everything that's necessary to be a wonderful local journalist, like Hanna Supper, for example, is, it's always the same. You need interest in what you are doing. You need interest in the community, and the publishers need to bring everything to their workforce, what they need. And since we are talking about dangers to journalists today, they also need to help their staff to be safe. Therefore, for example, we are doing together with ECPMF this Find Build study, knowing and that in all over Germany today, obviously, people feel challenged by journalists. And while in earlier times they abstained from going directly against the young journalists, today they really attack them more and more. This happens more and more. And it's not, as we thought, experience, especially in Eastern Germany, but this today happens all over Germany. It started prominently a few years ago with the Pegida movement, and today it's those Spaziergänge against COVID. And since we don't really have numbers to tell about and to confront or to ask the government for help or for legislative measures, we first need to really find the numbers that our colleague from Italy already has. Second, we want to install for 3 years place to tell about all the dangers that journalists are confronted with: hate speech, death, oh God, Drohung auf English. Sorry, I don't know the word. I lost the word just for the moment. And for 3 years, we want to install a platform where journalists can tell about the dangers they are facing, so that we have an idea about the massiveness of the problem. Mm-hmm. And also, there's already a new Schutzkodex, or let's translate it into Codex of Shelter, that some of our publishing houses and some of our media houses in Germany already have adopted. I wrote down what it, for instance, entails. It's, for example, it means that the publishing houses will give to their journalists legal and psychological help. That will entail social media watch, looking out for hate speech, for example. They will help move the journalists when it's necessary, because their address is known to their haters. And yeah, that's the most important part of this. And that's a lot of some of our bigger publishing houses already have adopted this Codex of Shelter.
Okay. That's very important, and we are of course happy with ECPMF that we can contribute to this. And yeah, let's hope that this will appear just less and less. I would now, time is short. It's going to be very short. I would like to give the word to Hanna Supa, which Anja already mentioned. She's editor-in-chief of the Leipziger Volkszeitung and as well editor-in-chief for digital transformation and regional innovation for the entire Metzak Media Group, which Leipziger Volkszeitung belongs to. So I would like to give you the floor now to present your case study on successful digital transformation of original print media, which is a very challenging topic, of course.
Thank you very much for having me. Quick question, are you able to hear me? Because I experienced some technical issues right now. Is it okay?
We can hear you.
Great. Okay, that's great. So thank you very much that I can join this fine group of people. Two I know already, Rasmus and Anja. Hi to you. Yes, I'm in Leipzig right now, and I've been a passionate a local journalist for 20 years now, and I'm here as an editor-in-chief for 1 year and a half. And let me introduce to you maybe this this paper to understand more what our challenges are. We heard a lot from Julia about like small startups, small local businesses, but we are like a really old, proud brand. The Leipziger Volkszeitung exists for 128 years now, which is a very time. So there was a lot of transformation happening in the past years. So this is one of a lot of challenges this brand has experienced in the last years. After the Second World War, during the GDR times, it was the voice of the United Socialist Party of East Germany, so of the SED. So it was not like a free publication, only until 1990. For another daily circulation of about 136,000 printed papers every day. We are published not only in this big city of Leipzig, but also in the rural areas in the western part of Saxony. And we used to have, so maybe this is the first challenge we could talk about, have a circulation of like 190,000 printed papers only in the year 2015. So it is not long ago, and we experienced that the print circulation is shrinking a lot. We are a regional newspaper, but we have a high claim to have a nationwide focus as well. So we inform not only about Leipzig, but about the villages in our circulation area, about Saxony and whole Germany. We are part, as Anja, as Lucy mentioned, of the Metzak Media Group, one of the largest regional media companies in Germany. And one big step that there was for us, like facing the challenge that our print circulation is shrinking, is that we, in 2014, to found a central editorial office for our regional brands, which is the Redaktionsnetzwerk Deutschland, it is called. So for all our local brands all over Germany, like the Ostsee-Zeitung, the Hannoversche Allgemeine, and other newspapers, we have and it provides us the nationwide news. And so journalists in Hanover and Berlin are doing the nationwide journalism. So we can focus here in Leipzig on our regional news, on our local news in Leipzig, all the small towns our local journalists are, which was a very big step for us, because now we are able to really focus what is going on here in our region, and are still able to have like this high claim that we have on right news and to inform people about what is going on in Germany and Europe and in the world as well, but not like doing everything just from here. So the challenges I have like 5 points of challenges I share with you. The first is obviously the print circulation is shrinking, and our readers of the newspaper are very old. Most of them are over 70 years old. Most of them. We have to reach new target groups, and the question is, how do we reach this new audience? And is of the paper, sure, but not putting all our effort in it more. So we all reorganized our newsroom, we reorganized our teams. We don't think in printed paper categories. We topic about where to put it in the paper. So we organized all of our editorial departments here in Leipzig. So we don't have like this 15 journalists that are doing local journalism from Leipzig. We have themed teams. So there is a department now for urban development and infrastructure. There's a department now for SIFE. And all of these things that are really interesting for the people in the city and this area, and which is like think more in topics and not in the paper. And for sure, we focus on digital publishing, and that's a challenge as well as an opportunity, because Leipzig is a really great city. It's really modern. There's a lot of young people living here, and I think there's a good way to reach new audiences, because there are young people that we can reach here. And to reach new groups, I have like this one thing that we do, which is so simple, but I think it's so important. We have to be better journalists. It's just that simple, because as a local journalist, you can't just not report, just like go somewhere and write down what you saw and what happened. So you have to be a real journalist and like to inform people, to dig deeper, to really have the important questions that you ask, and to be critical. And I think that's something that maybe in some small cities would not made that much in the past. So that's a real focus. We work a lot on our local journalism. And
sorry for interrupting. We have just 3 more minutes till the end of the session. So just would like to let you finish your thoughts, but if you would have two more minutes for at least one question, would be great.
Okay, then just one point which is really important, or 2 points are really important. For me, it's really important to getting closer to our audiences, like to getting closer to our readers and to the people that we do that journalism for. So we are not just a news outlet. We have something in common with our readers at local news. We have the same hometown. So we have to like build a club. We have to have this like warmness with the brand. So we do a lot of talks. We do a lot of meetings with our readers. Sometimes I just go out in a pub to have a beer with the readers and to talk about what is important to them. So be really close to the audience, because we're all living in the same area. This is one really important point. And the other is, Anja mentioned it, this is a really tough area sometimes in which we are living and which our paper is coming out. So how do we reach people that seem to be far away from the democratic discourse? And that's a real challenge. I don't have a conclusion to that right now, but I think to talk with them, to be transparent, to explain how we do journalism, and to be better journalists, I think is one step to maybe reach some of the people that may be lost otherwise. for our discourse.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot. We can just agree with that, I think. So we are unfortunately already nearly at the end of the session. I would just have in mind at least one question to come back to Rasmus, and to quote one of his questions he raised in his prediction for journalism 2021. And which is pretty relevant for what we heard, I think. Are we trying to restore the journalism we had or build toward the different journalism we want? And we had now also different views of small publishers, big publishers. Can publishers find any common interests? Rasmus, to have a...
No, I don't think publishers have very many common interests. I mean, I'm glad that they have some common interest, and that trade associations such as the German Publishers Association fight for those common interests. But in many cases, they're just fundamentally different and want different things and aspire to do different things. And I think that's probably healthy. I mean, that's part of the diversity that Julia and Francesca and others have talked about. And, you know, everyone has to make their own choices. And I always say that it's not my job to tell other people how to do their jobs. I think journalism can thrive in many different forms, and it's up to journalists and editors to decide what kind of journalism they want to practice and who they want to practice it for. That said, I think there is a rearguard who aspire to sort of restore what they see as a romanticized vision of the journalism of the past. And there's a vanguard of journalists who are forging different ways towards the future, whether they are building on a proud legacy like the Leipziger Volkszeitung, or starting something new like Correctiv and the different partners that you are working with. And I think their aspiration is better journalism for tomorrow. And I suppose that is what our research suggests that much of the public wants, that the public actually shares a lot of ideals with journalists. They would like journalism to be factually accurate. They would like it to be duly impartial. They would like it to help them understand the world in which they live. And the problem is not that people don't want journalism, is that they are often disappointed with the journalism that they see and don't feel that it actually enhances their lives or help them be better citizens or live the lives they want to live. So I think Hannah put it very well towards the end, that part of the challenge at the moment, which really is challenging. There are a lot of external pressures, whether business or politics or the harassment, particularly women face online and minorities face online. But that said, I think it's also an opportunity to show the value of what journalism can be at its best. And I think there is a public demand for that, that we see for both for new startups and for legacy titles that reinvent themselves.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, this has to be a closing word, but I think it's a very clear message to keep the diversity, and we need both. And we need, first of all, be a real journalists. So to come back to the roots, but at the same time to simply get adjusted or accept the new times and the new challenges which are coming with the digital times. So I keep fingers crossed to all publishers, and thanks a lot to all of our speakers, and hopefully let's continue this discussion another time. So thank you very much, and have a good afternoon to all of you and to our listeners too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Bye.
It's been a month since the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February, and today we'd like to give a voice to Ukrainian journalists as part of our spotlight interviews. Olga Tokariuk is honoring us with her participation in the MFRR Summit 2022. Hi, Olga. Hi. Thank you very much for joining me today. My name is Camille Petit. I'm working as a European Federation of Journalists. And we're going to discuss for 15 minutes about your current situation as a journalist working in Ukraine. For the public here, I'm going to introduce you briefly. You're an independent journalist based in Ukraine. You have a vast experience working as a freelancer with Ukrainian but also international media such as Time, Washington Post, BuzzFeed News, USA, FA in Spain. These are some of the media outlets you've been working with. Olga, let me first ask you how you're doing in these tragic circumstances as a Ukrainian citizen, but also as a journalist.
Hi, Camille. It's a very hard time for all Ukrainians, and journalists are not an exception, because we are not only reporting about the war that Russia launched against our country, but we are also living this war. Our families are affected by it. Our friends are affected. We are losing people we know. Some of my acquaintances, my friends, have been killed. Many of my friends joined the army, joined the territorial defense units, and they are now defending Ukraine against Russian aggression. So, this is very personal, of course. Like, it's very hard to watch the images of innocent civilians, children, pregnant women who are getting hit by, Russian missiles and Russian bombs on a daily.
It's been a month since the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February, and today we'd like to give a voice to Ukrainian journalists as part of our spotlight interviews. Olga Tokariuk is honoring us with her participation in the MFRR Summit 2022. Hi, Olga. Hi. Thank you very much for joining me today. My name is Camille Petit. I'm working as a European Federation of Journalists. And we're going to discuss for 15 minutes about your current situation as a journalist working in Ukraine. For the public here, I'm going to introduce you briefly. You're an independent journalist based in Ukraine. You have a vast experience working as a freelancer with Ukrainian but also international media such as Time, Washington Post, BuzzFeed News, USA, FA in Spain. These are some of the media outlets you've been working with. Olga, let me first ask you how you're doing in these tragic circumstances as a Ukrainian citizen, but also as a journalist.
Hi, Camille. It's a very hard time for all Ukrainians, and journalists are not an exception, because we are not only reporting about the war that Russia launched against our country, but we are also living this war. Our families are affected by it. Our friends are affected. We are losing people we know. Some of my acquaintances, my friends, have been killed. Many of my friends joined the army, joined the territorial defense units, and they are now defending Ukraine against Russian aggression. So, this is very personal, of course. Like, it's very hard to watch the images of innocent civilians, children, pregnant women who are getting hit by, Russian missiles and Russian bombs on a daily basis. But there is also like this huge spirit of resistance inside Ukraine, of determination and of, fight. And as a journalist, I'm trying to contribute in a way to this effort by doing my job, by reporting on what is happening, by speaking with international media. I'm lucky that I can reach the audiences beyond Ukraine thanks to social media, thanks to my Twitter. I have more than 300,000 followers there, and most of them joined, of course, since the start of war. And I'm grateful that there is a platform, I can tell people what is happening. I'm also happy that I can write for international media who express their interest in the events in Ukraine. I had some experience before the war, and now, of course, there is even more interest. So just in recent weeks, my articles were published in Time magazine. on the daily beast, in the Evening Standard in the UK. So, and I'm doing a lot of interviews every day, like up to 10, sometimes 20 interviews for media from across the globe, from South Korea and Japan to Australia to Chile, United States, of course, all of Europe, telling, what is happening here in Ukraine and how Ukrainians are fighting, how they are resisting despite all odds against Russian aggression.
What's your daily life looking at the moment?
Well, I'm currently in Western Ukraine. Me and my family, we fled here in some days before the Russian invasion started. We were thinking that it would be a short vacation, but for more than 1 month already, we are unable to return, to our home in Kyiv, where we lived. And we are seeing the images that every day Russian missiles are hitting residential blocks in Kyiv, and we are wondering whether we will be able to return to, our apartment, our beloved and cozy apartment in Kyiv. Well, hopefully, we will return to Kyiv, that's for sure. I just don't know whether our home will be still intact. So here in Western Ukraine, we are, also trying to help other internally displaced people. Me and my family are now currently internally displaced, but we are housing other people, our friends from Kyiv region, who lived in the village that is currently under Russian occupation. And in that village, actually, recently, journalists of Fox News were killed. So for them, there is absolutely no way to return. So we're trying to take care, of this internally displaced people, give them shelter, take care of each other. Our children are playing together somehow, trying to pretend it's some sort of normal life, although of course it isn't. And of course we are facing, also here in Western Ukraine, although the impact of war is not felt as much as elsewhere, there is no fighting in this part of the country, but the war still is felt because we hear sirens every day and every night. Basically, we have to go to bomb shelters. Sometimes the sirens interrupt my interviews, and sometimes I have to, cancel my scheduled tasks because of them, because, you never know how long the alert will last and how long you will have to stay in the bomb shelter. And also I was reporting from here, from Western Ukraine, on the big mobilization of volunteers who are helping, sending help to both the soldiers on the front line, but also to civilians who are stranded in areas affected by fighting. So there's a lot of work, in fact, for journalists, a lot to cover.
There are many Ukrainian journalists who are suddenly becoming a war reporter because they used to cover sports, or culture, or political topics. Did you cover any conflicts beforehand, and how prepared were you?
Well, I was never a war reporter, and war in Ukraine actually began in 2014, 8 years ago, when Russia illegally occupied and annexed Crimea and also started the war in some parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And a lot of my colleagues were covering this war already then. I wasn't one of them. My profile was always international, affairs. I was working as a foreign news correspondent. I was the head of international news desk at independent Ukrainian Hromadske TV for 6 years. And only in the last 2 years, I'm working more with international media, reporting for them on Ukraine, on the events inside Ukraine. So, of course, I never never aspired to be a war reporter. And of course, I never wanted the war to start in my country. That was a big, shock back in 2014. And of course, it's a huge trauma now. But I see my mission now as, as I'm already in these circumstances, I can't change them. So I see my mission as to stay in Ukraine as long as possible, and to report on the events as long as possible. I'm not as courageous maybe as many of my colleagues who are going to the front line, who are going to the hottest places, to Kharkiv, to Chernihiv, to Kyiv, to Odessa, to other parts of southern Ukraine, to Mariupol, which is besieged by Russian troops as we speak. So I'm not on the front line, but I'm still in Ukraine, and I'm planning to stay here for as long as it is safe, not as much for me, but for my family, for my child.
I think it's fair to say that there is a lot of propaganda and disinformation going on at the moment. As a journalist, how are you able to keep high ethical standards in your reporting?
Yes, the flow of disinformation and propaganda is huge, coming from Russian state media, coming from Russian officials, coming from social networks where many are repeating, Russian claims. This is not something new for us in Ukraine, and as journalists, we've been witnessing that for at least the last 8 years. I think this might be a revelation for many in the West, in general, abroad, that disinformation is so widespread and it sometimes is so blatant, it's so outrageous. But for us in Ukraine, we've been following what Russian state media have been saying about Ukraine, dehumanizing Ukrainians, sowing hatred for the last 8 years. So this is not actually something surprising. And partly this disinformation machine and propaganda machine is what led to this war, because so many people in Russia believed in it. And, they thought that, the war was something that could be done, that it wasn't, something to be avoided, but that the war was even in a way desirable. So now I'm personally, as a journalist, encountered just one example, a case study of Russian disinformation and propaganda is about a pregnant woman who was injured in Mariupol in a shelling of a maternity hospital there. And Russian embassies on their Twitter accounts started disseminating, the conspiracy that it was all staged, that this woman was a crisis actor, that she was wearing makeup, that she wasn't pregnant, in fact. Well, I covered the story. I got in touch with relatives of this woman. Her name is Marianna. I spoke to them. They sent me photos that confirmed that she was indeed their relative, that she was pregnant. And they spoke also to her husband in the aftermath of this bombing. He told them that she gave birth to a baby 2 days after this bombing happened. And I think I was the first journalist to, write about that publicly on my social media. Then also I wrote for Daily Beast an article about that. So we are bombarded constantly by a lot of propaganda and disinformation, and our role as a journalist is to I don't know, whether we are able to debunk that, but we should report on what is actually happening, and we should collect as much evidence of what is in fact happening as we can.
You mentioned previously that you work for many international news media. I believe you have a lot of contacts of journalists also working abroad and now maybe coming to Ukraine. How do you perceive foreign media coverage of the conflict, and how do you interact with your fellow colleagues in the field?
Well, there is a huge interest of international media to what is happening now in Ukraine, but I also must say that it's very dangerous to work as journalists now in Ukraine. At least 4 journalists have been killed by Russian troops in this war, and I happen to know 2 of them. The first casualty, the first victim of this war, a journalist victim, was my former colleague, Ukrainian cameraman Yevgeny Sakun. He was killed by Russian missile in Kyiv. And then one of other journalists who were killed, I also happened to know him, cameraman of Fox News, Pierre Zakrzewski. So this is, of course, very heartbreaking to know that your colleagues are getting killed in this senseless war, deliberately targeted by Russian troops, because, it is deliberate, because they were wearing helmets, so they were wearing protective vests with press signs on them, and still they were targeted, which means that, Russia is trying to intimidate, the media is trying to intimidate editors of big media all over the world with these killings, to prevent them from coming to Ukraine, from sending their correspondents on the ground. And actually, even after that, I after this killings, after this journalist death, I noticed a change in my communication with my editors, of the international media. They are more concerned now about my safety. They are asking me more questions, where I am, whether it's safe, because they also have to include, these risks in whether they want to accept a story that I pitch to them or not, because they have to calculate these risks. They don't want to expose even freelancers as me who work for them to additional risks. And of course, freelancers are always those who are most, at risk in any war. Very often, the media do not offer them assistance. They do not offer them insurance. So for freelancers, it's very often they're working at their own risk. And many of my brave colleagues, many of them Ukrainian, are now actually taking this risk at their own, kind of free will, but they are particularly exposed, and they are risking the most, much more than correspondents who are, staff workers of big international media.
Yeah, this is something also we noticed. We had requests from major news organization in Europe sending journalists to Ukraine with no particular safety training or risk assessment training, or even proper equipment, protective equipment. What would be your advice to those young, sometimes, not always, freelance sometimes, or employed journalists now going to Ukraine?
Well, my advice would be, if you don't have experience in war zones, if you haven't done trainings on medical aid, on survival in a conflict zone, don't go. Of course, the war is a chance to, become prominent, to make a career, to have your name published in big media, or your photos published in big media, or your videos. But if you are not, if you haven't done proper training, if you do not have enough protective equipment, if you're coming here and you don't know anyone, or you do not have people on the ground who, will be able to advise you about the safe zones, the no-go zones, the risky zones, think twice and even 10 times, because the war is always, very, very dangerous, and journalists are risking their lives, are losing their lives, and it's, also kind of remarkable and heartbreaking that among those journalists who were killed already in Ukraine, there were very experienced reporters who were covering a lot of wars in Syria and Afghanistan, in Iraq, like the American reporter working with who previously worked with the New York Times, with Time magazine. He was very experienced, and still he was killed here. So freelancers are particularly exposed, and only go and do your reporting if you are sure that you have all the protective equipment, if you have people on the ground who would accompany you and advise you, and if you had undergone relevant training.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you so much for continuing working in such difficult circumstances. Thank you for taking the time today to speak with us, and please stay safe. Thanks.
Thank you.
And this spotlight interview with the Ukrainian journalist Olga Tokariuk, conducted by EFJ's Camille Petit, concludes the MFRR Summit 2022, Boosting Press Freedom. For a second year now, we had to conduct this summit online, but hopefully in 2023, we will again be able to gather in the same physical space to look deeper into the issues surrounding media freedom. Over the course of 3 days, we welcomed a total of 48 people, including 31 speakers, 7 moderators, and 10 workshop hosts in 6 sessions, 3 workshops, and 3 spotlight interviews. During these 3 days, we focused on the safety of journalists, legal threats targeting media, and the significance of pluralistic media for a democratic society. In addition to the panels, we also aired spotlight interviews with Ukrainian and Russian journalists to shed light on to the ongoing Russian invasion in Ukraine. The Media Freedom Rapid Response is organized by an alliance led by the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, including Article 19, the European Federation of Journalists, Free Press Unlimited, the Institute for Applied Informatics at the University of Leipzig, International Press Institute, and Observatorio Balcania Caucaso Transeuropa. The MFRR, commenced in 2020, is funded by the European Commission. The MFRR tracks, monitors, and reacts to violations of press and media freedom in EU member states and candidate countries. This project provides legal and practical support, public advocacy, and information to protect journalists and media workers. Thank you for following the MFRR Summit 2022, Boosting Press Freedom, and we hope to meet you again in the upcoming events.